Hi there, Steve Kaufman of Link. But today I don't want to talk about languages. I kind of have beaten that subject to death somewhat. As you know, I'm a great believer that anyone can learn languages, and I've devoted a fair amount of my time to learning languages and to offering free advice to people on how to learn languages, and I will continue doing that. But I also like to expound on other things that world events and things of that nature. And today I want to talk a bit about the Pope's statement on capitalism. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I've got it here in front of me. But the gist of it is that capitalism, the overall impression created is that capitalism is bad. It's out of control. It breeds inequality. Inequality breeds violence. It's inherently unfair that some people have a lot and other people have less. And so this was the general gist of his message. And of course, a lot of people immediately chime in to agree with the Pope and so forth. Let me say, to get my conclusions up front, I completely disagree with the Pope. I'm reading an interesting book right now by a person called Steven Pinker, and he catalogs, with reference to a number of in-depth studies, he catalogs the decline of violence. And it's absolutely astounding to the extent to which violence in our societies has declined over the last 100 years, 200 years. There have been exceptions. There have been exceptions like the First and Second World Wars. But even with that, the level of violence that in most parts of the world that we experience is far, far lower than it was 500 years ago, 400, 300 years ago. So I suggest that people read this book. It's called something like The Better Angels of Our Nature. And I, again, can't remember all of the arguments, but it's obvious in that book that things like democracy, like capitalism, have contributed to this massive decline in violence. And if you read the things that the Pope is talking about, how capitalism creates inequality, creates violence. Well, what is this other golden age that he is referring to? Perhaps it was the period when religion held sway. And there Pinker catalogs the incredible instruments of torture that the Catholic Church, and not probably only the Catholic Church, but which were used in the name of religion to torture with unspeakable cruelty people who were considered to be, heretics or who weren't towing the party line and so forth. And if we look at, regimes where ideology has held sway, like Mao's China or Stalin's Russia or Hitler's Germany, wherever ideology takes over, we have higher levels of violence. Where people are concerned about making money, and it's not through some unselfish motivation that the capitalist improves the living standard of other people. It's because you have, in a properly functioning capitalist society, you have the opportunity to own the means of production. You can start a company, you can start producing things, you can compete with others, others can compete with you. So rather than a society where you have the king or the high priest or the knight that can charge around and lop off heads at will, or lead his gang of thugs into war at will, which was the situation that prevailed everywhere in the world, in primitive societies, as Pinker points out, in Europe, in Asia, where small-scale battles, large-scale battles, the willingness to resort to violence to settle disputes, everything was criminality was much higher in previous centuries, and the decline in this violence, the improvement in our standards of living, the improvement in the health standards, longevity, even in countries like India and China, all owes its origin to the expansion of capitalism, because you can actually see it from the end of the 18th century. You see this. Granted, there were excesses and there was child labor and so forth, but the overall trend from that period on has been dramatic improvement in the standard of living. In fact, only since then have living standards in the world improved. Prior to that, people lived at subsistence levels. Whenever there was a famine in one area, everyone died. Not everyone died, but a high percentage of people died. There were vast epidemics. Many children were born. Most of them died. And now, through the evil pharmaceutical industry and all these other evil industries, we in fact have a better standard of living. That doesn't mean that there aren't excesses of commercialism. There aren't aspects of commercialism that we all find distasteful. But it is less damaging, less violent, less detrimental to the quality of human life. More people in China today live at a better standard of living, and in India than they did, say in the case of China, when they were under Mao, and at the whim of one leader, he could condemn 1 million people to die in different campaigns in the 50s, or on some harebrained scheme of smelting all the utensils and so forth in backyard iron smelters, and therefore neglecting what the peasants should have been doing. The result was that 40, 50 million people died. I mean, let's get serious. Capitalism works. Now, that's not to say that that it shouldn't be regulated. And I personally find it appalling that executives in some companies make, $20 million a year when their workforce makes 50,000. And there was a referendum in Switzerland to limit the how much money senior executives could make, and it was voted out. But I have some sympathy with that perspective. I think it's obscene that they make so much money, and it is an old boys club, and there's lots of injustice in the world. There's no question that the senior executives who sit on the boards and get paid obscene amounts of money to sit on boards and approve these high salaries for their friends and stuff, there's great inequality. But it was ever so. I mean, there was great Mao had all his harem of women and did whatever he pleased. In the 19th or 18th and 17th century, like 50% of the country's GDP was basically consisted of the consumption of the court, of the royal court. I mean, this is just if you compare the day today's social and economic conditions with just about any other period in history, we are better off today, and that's what the Pope kind of loses sight of. That there may be excesses in capitalism. There are certainly excesses in the various religions. Human beings are very imperfect beings, but in terms of creating wealth, improving standards of living, improving standards of health, providing more food for people, capitalism has been a phenomenally positive force. And I am far less skeptical and suspicious of someone who wants to make money than I am of someone who is promoting his ideology or his religion at me. Because I have found that a lot of the idealists become so wrapped up in their ideals that all means are justified by their great belief in their ideal. Whereas a businessman, he's out to make money and he has to compete in the market, and I prefer that. So I just thought I would offer these words, which I'm sure are going to set the cat amongst the pigeons, as they say. And I look forward to your comments, which I suspect will consist of a lot of negative comments and a lot of thumbs down, because people are taught at school that profit is bad, that business people are bad, and that somehow people who are not into business are better. And it's always been that way throughout history. The producers and the merchants that trade and create the wealth were always considered bad, whereas the knight who killed people and the religious person who persecuted people and the king who had this unlimited conspicuous consumption, they were all good. So it was ever thus. I don't know why it is. There's probably an evolutionary explanation. But trade is good, reciprocity is good, and it beats idealism in the long run. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.